All right, let's dive into a crisis that really pushed the world right to the edge. The scene is a super tense emergency meeting at the United Nations Security Council. And the topic? The capture of a head of state. It's an event that has global powers staring each other down, and it's shaking the very foundations of international law.
This whole firestorm really boils down to one single explosive question. Can one country, for any reason, just send its military into another sovereign nation to capture and arrest its leader? That's the debate that basically paralyzed the UN, and it's what we're going to break down right now.
So, what kicked this all off? Well, on January 3rd, 2026, the world woke up to some pretty shocking news. A U.S. military special operation had gone down in Caracas, the capital of Venezuela, and their target was President Nicolas Maduro, who was captured right along with his wife. This one act just lit the fuse on an international diplomatic explosion. So, as you can imagine, condemnations are flying in from all over the globe. But the United States? They were the first ones to step up to the podium at the UN to defend this pretty unprecedented action. And they had a very, very specific story they wanted the world to hear. Now, the language the U.S. used here is absolutely critical. Ambassador Mike Waltz was really clear. This was not a war. This was not an invasion. He framed it as a law enforcement operation. And that was a deliberate choice, right? They wanted to portray Maduro not as a head of state, but as a criminal, an alleged narco-trafficker who had to be brought to justice in an American court. And to back this up, the U.S. reached back into the history books. They pointed to their 1989 operation to capture Panamanian leader Manuel Noriega as a precedent. Their argument was basically, hey, we've done this before. They were trying to normalize the whole thing by showing it wasn't the first time they'd gone into another country to grab a leader they saw as a criminal. And here it is, the legal cornerstone of their entire defense, Article 51 of the UN Charter. The U.S. argued they were just acting in self-defense. They claimed Maduro's alleged drug trafficking was a direct threat to the United States and was destabilizing the whole region, which, in their view, justified the raid under international law. So the key here is they weren't claiming a right to invade, but a right to self-defense. But the rest of the world? Yeah, they weren't buying it. The U.S. justification was met with this immediate, fierce backlash from allies and adversaries alike. That Security Council chamber turned into a verbal battleground, and fast. Venezuela's ambassador, Samuel Moncada, he did not mince words. He called the raid a kidnapping. He basically warned the UN that if they let this stand, they'd be opening the door to a world where might makes right, where powerful countries could just go and take any leader they don't like. He completely rejected that whole law enforcement story from the US. And this really gets us to the two completely opposite positions at the heart of this whole debate. On one side, you have the U.S. saying this was a justified police action. On the other, you have most of the world seeing an illegal act of aggression and a blatant violation of Venezuela's right to govern itself. There was just no middle ground here. Now, leading the charge against the U.S., no surprise, were some of its traditional rivals. Russia's ambassador called it an act of armed aggression. China labeled it a brazen violation of sovereignty. And both of them were totally united in their demand. Nicolas Maduro and his wife had to be released immediately. But here's the thing, this wasn't just a showdown between the big superpowers. The criticism was coming from all corners of the globe, creating this chorus of condemnation that left the United States looking pretty isolated on the world stage. And the sheer breadth of the opposition was kind of stunning. This wasn't just the usual suspects lining up against the U.S. The list includes huge regional powers in Latin America, like Brazil, Colombia, and Mexico. It includes nations like South Africa. And critically, it even includes key European allies like Spain and France. It was a truly global pushback. The Brazilian ambassador's statement really captures the core fear that so many nations were feeling. The worry wasn't just about Venezuela. It was about the precedent this sets. I mean, if the U.S. can do this in Caracas, what's to stop them from doing it in any other capital city? It was seen as a direct threat to the whole idea of national sovereignty itself. And maybe the most telling criticism of all came from France, a permanent member of the Security Council and a close U.S. ally. The French delegation said flat out that the raid went against the core principle of resolving disputes peacefully. You know, when even your friends are publicly criticizing your actions on the world stage, you know you've crossed a pretty significant line. Okay, so beyond all the diplomatic fireworks at the UN, what was the actual plan on the ground?
The debate pretty quickly shifted from whether the raid was legal to what the U.S. was planning to do next with Venezuela. And then, back in Washington, then-President Donald Trump made a series of pretty shocking statements that revealed a much, much bigger agenda. He declared that the United States would be reimbursed for all of its expenses and that the money would come from Venezuela's massive oil reserves. This made it sound like the whole intervention was about a lot more than just one guy. The president then laid out a clear three-step plan. First, senior U.S. officials would basically help run the country. Second, American oil companies would be brought in to get the nation's crumbling oil industry back up and running. And third, all the money from that oil would be used to pay the U.S. back. This was, for all intents and purposes, a plan for the direct U.S. management of Venezuela's entire economy. But the reality in Caracas, it was way more complicated. Despite those bold announcements from Washington, there were no clear signs of U.S. control. A new interim president had been sworn in, and he was calling for a respectful relationship with the U.S. But at the same time, armed pro-Maduro militias were still on the streets. The situation on the ground was tense, fragile, and deeply, deeply uncertain.
You know, this whole crisis forces us to face a really fundamental question. The UN Charter, it was designed to prevent exactly this kind of thing. But when the world's most powerful country acts alone, using its own interpretation of the law, what happens to the rules everyone else is supposed to play by? It kind of leaves us all wondering, in the 21st century, is justice just decided by whoever is the strongest?